In the twilight hours of a Florentine evening in 1513, as shadows danced across the stone walls of his modest estate in Sant'Andrea in Percasina, Niccolò Machiavelli sat hunched over his writing desk, quill in hand. Exiled from the political arena he once dominated, stripped of his position as Secretary of the Second Chancery, he had been granted the cruel gift of perspective. What emerged from those contemplative months would become not merely observations on statecraft, but a profound meditation on the architecture of weakness that undermines human potential. The flickering candlelight illuminated pages upon pages of notes, observations of princes and paupers alike, all united by a common thread, the invisible chains of weakness that bound them to mediocrity. Machiavelli understood, perhaps better than any political theorist before or since, that true power, whether exercised over kingdoms or over oneself, requires the systematic elimination of every form of weakness that corrupts the human spirit. As autumn leaves gathered outside his window, Machiavelli reflected on the lessons learned from decades of observing human nature in its rawest forms. He had witnessed the rise and fall of the Medici, the brutal efficiency of Cesare Borgia, and the complex machinations that determined the fate of Italian city-states. Through it all, one truth crystallized with startling clarity. Weakness was not merely an absence of strength, but an active force of destruction that consumed individuals and institutions from within. The first and most insidious form of weakness that Machiavelli identified was the tyranny of emotional dependency. He had observed countless leaders, merchants, and common citizens whose decisions were not guided by rational calculation but by the desperate need for approval, love, or acceptance from others. This emotional dependency, he noted, created a fundamental vulnerability that enemies could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Consider the case of Piero Soderini, the gonfaloniere of Florence during Machiavelli's tenure. Soderini was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine goodwill, yet his administration crumbled precisely because of his inability to act without consensus. His need to be loved by all factions rendered him paralyzed when decisive action was required. Machiavelli watched with growing frustration as Soderini's emotional dependency on popular approval prevented him from making the hard choices necessary to preserve Florentine independence. The antidote to emotional dependency, Machiavelli realized, was not the suppression of emotions but their proper subordination to rational will. A truly strong individual must cultivate what he termed emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel deeply while never allowing those feelings to compromise strategic thinking. This required developing an internal locus of validation that rendered external approval irrelevant to one's core decision-making processes. Machiavelli's own exile provided him with an unexpected laboratory for testing this principle. Stripped of the social validation that had defined his identity for decades, he was forced to confront the question of who he was when removed from the external structures that had previously given his life meaning. The answer that emerged was both liberating and terrifying. He was whoever he chose to become, independent of society's recognition or approval. This realization led to the second major category of weakness that demanded elimination: the illusion of moral purity. Machiavelli had observed that individuals who insisted on maintaining perfect moral consistency in an imperfect world inevitably found themselves crushed by those willing to employ the full spectrum of human behavior to achieve their objectives. The weakness lay not in having moral principles, but in allowing those principles to become rigid constraints that prevented effective action when circumstances demanded flexibility. The political landscape of Renaissance Italy provided countless examples of this phenomenon. Leaders who refused to employ deception when facing opponents who had no such scruples found their territories conquered and their people enslaved. Merchants who insisted on complete honesty in all dealings were systematically outmaneuvered by competitors who understood that successful business required strategic ambiguity and selective revelation of information. Machiavelli's insight was not that morality should be abandoned, but rather that it should be understood as a tool to be employed when appropriate, rather than a master to be blindly obeyed. True strength required the wisdom to recognize when conventional morality served one's larger purposes and when adherence to it would result in outcomes that violated the deeper moral imperative of protecting and advancing one's legitimate interests. This principle extended beyond the realm of politics into every aspect of human interaction. A parent who never employed strategic deception with their children, never told them that Santa Claus existed or that the injection would not hurt, was failing to prepare those children for a world in which strategic communication was a necessary survival skill. The weakness lay in confusing tactical honesty with strategic wisdom. The third form of weakness that Machiavelli identified was perhaps the most fundamental: the fear of solitude and the accompanying need to conform to group expectations. He had observed that most human beings were willing to sacrifice their deepest convictions and their most advantageous opportunities rather than risk social isolation. This fear created a kind of intellectual and moral paralysis that prevented individuals from developing the independent judgment necessary for true effectiveness. In the courtyards and council chambers of Florence, Machiavelli had witnessed countless instances where intelligent individuals supported obviously flawed policies simply because those policies enjoyed popular support. The fear of standing alone against consensus opinion had corrupted their judgment and rendered them complicit in decisions they privately knew to be disastrous. The cultivation of comfort with solitude, therefore, became essential to the development of genuine strength. This did not mean becoming antisocial or dismissive of others' perspectives, but rather developing the internal fortitude to stand by one's convictions even when doing so resulted in temporary isolation. True leaders, Machiavelli observed, were often those who were willing to endure periods of unpopularity in service of long-term objectives that others could not yet perceive. This principle required a fundamental reorientation of one's relationship with social approval. Instead of seeking validation through conformity, strength came from earning respect through consistent demonstration of independent judgment and unwavering commitment to one's principles. The irony, Machiavelli noted, was that those who were least dependent on others' approval often found themselves most genuinely respected and sought after for guidance. As winter settled over the Tuscan countryside, Machiavelli's reflections turned to the practical mechanisms through which these forms of weakness could be systematically eliminated. The process, he realized, required nothing less than a complete reconstruction of one's relationship with discomfort, uncertainty, and social pressure. The first step in this transformation involved developing what modern psychology would later term distress tolerance, the ability to remain functional and clear-thinking in the face of emotional, physical, or social discomfort. Machiavelli had observed that most human beings made their worst decisions when trying to escape from uncomfortable feelings or situations. The urgency to relieve discomfort often led to choices that provided immediate relief but created far greater long-term problems. Consider the behavior of debtors who, faced with the discomfort of financial pressure, often made increasingly desperate decisions that only worsened their situations. Rather than enduring the temporary discomfort of reduced living standards and systematic debt repayment, they often borrowed additional money at worse terms or engaged in risky schemes that promised quick relief but typically resulted in total ruin. Machiavelli's prescription was counterintuitive: deliberately seek out situations that created moderate discomfort and practice remaining calm and clear thinking within them. This might involve engaging in physical challenges that push the boundaries of comfort, or placing oneself in social situations where one's status or competence was uncertain. The goal was not to become insensitive to discomfort, but to develop the capacity to function effectively. This practice had profound implications for decision-making under pressure. Individuals who were comfortable with discomfort were less likely to make desperate choices when faced with challenging circumstances. They could evaluate their options rationally rather than being driven by the urgent need to escape from uncomfortable feelings. This created a significant strategic advantage in negotiations, conflicts, and other high-pressure situations where clear thinking was essential. The second practical element of Machiavelli's program involved developing immunity to social manipulation. He had observed that most forms of interpersonal influence relied on exploiting predictable emotional responses to social pressure. Flattery worked because people were hungry for validation. Threats worked because people were afraid of conflict or loss. Guilt worked because people were terrified of being seen as selfish or inconsiderate. The antidote to these forms of manipulation was not to become emotionally numb, but to develop awareness of one's automatic responses and the ability to choose whether to act on them. This required cultivating what Machiavelli called emotional distance, the ability to observe one's own emotional reactions as information rather than as commands that must be immediately obeyed. When someone attempted to use flattery to influence a decision, the emotionally sovereign individual would notice the pleasure that the flattery created, without allowing that pleasure to compromise their judgment about the decision at hand. They would appreciate the compliment while remaining clear about whether the proposed action served their legitimate interests. Similarly, when faced with threats or guilt-inducing arguments, they would acknowledge the discomfort these created without automatically capitulating to relieve that discomfort. This principle extended to the realm of reciprocity and social obligation. Machiavelli had noticed that skilled manipulators often created artificial obligations through unsolicited favors or gifts, then leveraged those manufactured debts to secure compliance with their requests. The strong individual learned to distinguish between genuine mutual benefit and manufactured obligation, accepting favors graciously while maintaining clarity about what they actually owed in return. The third practical element involved developing what Machiavelli termed strategic patience, the ability to delay gratification and endure temporary disadvantage in service of long-term objectives. He had observed that most human beings discounted future benefits far too heavily relative to immediate pleasures or advantages. This temporal myopia created systematic weaknesses that more patient individuals could exploit. In the commercial sphere, Machiavelli had witnessed merchants who sacrificed long-term customer relationships for short-term profits, only to find themselves eventually bankrupted when their reputation for unfair dealing caught up with them. Conversely, those who were willing to accept smaller immediate profits in order to build trust and reputation often found themselves dominating their markets over time. This principle applied equally to personal relationships, career development, and skill acquisition. The willingness to endure periods of frustration and slow progress while mastering difficult skills created capabilities that could not be easily replicated by those seeking only immediate gratification. The patience to build relationships gradually based on mutual respect and demonstrated value created social capital that was far more durable than connections based on immediate exchange of favors. Strategic patience also extended to the realm of conflict. Machiavelli had observed that most people responded to provocations immediately and emotionally, often playing directly into their opponent's strategies. The patient individual learned to absorb initial attacks while carefully analyzing their opponent's weaknesses and developing comprehensive responses that address the underlying dynamics rather than merely reacting to surface provocations. As spring brought new life to the fields surrounding his estate, Machiavelli's thoughts turned to the broader implications of his analysis. The systematic elimination of weakness was not merely a personal development project, but a fundamental requirement for anyone who hoped to exercise meaningful influence in the world. Whether leading a family, managing a business, or governing a state, effectiveness required the kind of inner strength that could only be developed through deliberate confrontation with one's own weaknesses. The process was necessarily uncomfortable and often isolating. It required abandoning familiar but counterproductive patterns of thinking and behavior, often before replacement patterns had fully developed. This created periods of uncertainty and vulnerability that tested one's commitment to the transformation process. Many individuals, Machiavelli observed, began this work enthusiastically but abandoned it when they encountered the inevitable difficulties that arose during the transition period. The key to persevering through these challenging phases was developing a clear vision of the person one intended to become and the life one intended to live. This vision had to be compelling enough to sustain motivation through periods of discomfort and doubt, yet realistic enough to provide practical guidance for daily decisions. Without such a vision, the work of eliminating weakness often felt arbitrary and meaningless, leading to abandonment of the effort. Machiavelli's own vision had crystallized during his months of exile and reflection. He intended to become someone whose judgment could be trusted absolutely because it was based on careful analysis rather than emotional reactivity. He would develop the kind of inner strength that allowed him to remain calm and clear-thinking regardless of external circumstances. He would cultivate relationships based on mutual respect and genuine value rather than manipulation or neediness. Most importantly, he would learn to find satisfaction and meaning in the process of continuous growth and development rather than in the achievement of specific external markers of success. This orientation freed him from dependence on others' recognition while creating sustainable motivation for ongoing improvement. The work itself became its own reward, independent of any external validation or acknowledgement. This shift in orientation had profound implications for how one approached setbacks and failures. Instead of seeing them as evidence of inadequacy or reasons for discouragement, they became valuable sources of information about areas that required additional development. A business failure revealed weaknesses in planning or execution that could be corrected in future endeavors. A relationship conflict highlighted communication patterns or emotional reactions that needed attention. The strong individual learned to extract maximum value from every experience, especially negative ones. This was not a matter of forced optimism or denial of genuine problems, but rather a practical recognition that learning and growth were the only reliable sources of long-term satisfaction and security. External circumstances would always be subject to forces beyond one's control, but the capacity for continued development and adaptation could never be taken away. As summer approached and the familiar rhythms of agricultural life resumed around his estate, Machiavelli began to see his personal transformation in broader historical context. The elimination of weakness was not merely an individual project but a civilizational imperative. Societies that failed to cultivate strength in their citizens inevitably fell victim to those that understood these principles better. The decline of various Italian city-states provided clear illustrations of this dynamic. Those that had grown soft through prosperity, that had allowed their citizens to become dependent on external validation and immediate gratification, found themselves unable to resist more disciplined and determined opponents. The weakness that seemed harmless during periods of peace became fatal vulnerabilities when circumstances demanded strength and decisiveness. Conversely, societies that systematically cultivated strength in their members, that expected citizens to endure discomfort for collective benefit, that rewarded independent thinking over conformity, that prepared individuals to function effectively under pressure, demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of challenges that destroyed their weaker neighbors. This suggested that the work of eliminating personal weakness was not merely self-serving, but contributed to the strength and survival of one's community and civilization. Every individual who developed genuine inner strength became a resource that could be called upon during times of collective crisis. Every person who learned to think independently contributed to the collective wisdom available for solving complex problems. The summer months provided Machiavelli with opportunities to test his developing theories through interaction with neighbors, merchants, and the occasional political visitor who still sought his counsel despite his official exile. These encounters became laboratories for experimenting with new approaches to communication, conflict resolution, and influence. He began to notice subtle changes in how others responded to him as his own emotional sovereignty developed. People seemed to respect his opinions more, even when they disagreed with them. They were more likely to seek his advice on difficult decisions and more willing to accept his guidance when their own judgment was uncertain. The paradox was striking. As he became less dependent on others' approval, he found himself more genuinely valued and influential. This observation led to a deeper understanding of the relationship between personal strength and social influence. Most attempts at influence relied on some form of manipulation, appealing to others' weaknesses, fears, or desires in order to secure compliance. Such influence was necessarily temporary and created resentment that undermined long-term relationships. True influence, Machiavelli realized, came from demonstrating the kind of strength and wisdom that others wished to develop in themselves. When people observed someone who remained calm under pressure, who made decisions based on careful analysis rather than emotional reaction, who maintained their principles while adapting flexibly to changing circumstances, they naturally wanted to understand how such qualities could be developed. This created opportunities for genuine leadership that did not depend on formal authority or manipulation. The strong individual became a model that others sought to emulate, creating voluntary followership that was far more powerful than compliance based on fear or obligation. Such leadership was self-reinforcing, as helping others develop strength increased one's own influence and expanded the network of capable individuals available for collaboration. The autumn of Machiavelli's exile year brought a deepening understanding of the relationship between individual transformation and collective responsibility. The work of eliminating weakness was not a selfish pursuit, but a contribution to the common good that rippled outward in ways that might not be immediately visible but were nonetheless profound. Every conversation with someone struggling with self-doubt became an opportunity to model confidence based on competence rather than bravado. Every interaction with someone facing a difficult decision became a chance to demonstrate the kind of clear thinking that was possible when emotions were acknowledged but not allowed to dominate. Every encounter with conflict became a laboratory for practicing the kind of strength that de-escalated tensions rather than inflaming them. These micro-influences accumulated over time to create what Machiavelli began to think of as cultural transformation. As more individuals developed genuine strength, the overall level of discourse and decision-making in the community improved. Conflicts were resolved more quickly and with less collateral damage. Collective decisions reflected longer-term thinking and broader perspectives. The process was gradual and often invisible to those who were part of it. The changes occurred through countless small interactions rather than dramatic events. A merchant who learned to negotiate based on mutual benefit rather than manipulation influenced others to adopt similar approaches. A parent who developed the emotional strength to set consistent boundaries taught their children to respect both themselves and others. A citizen who learned to think independently contributed to more thoughtful public discussions of important issues. As his year of exile drew toward a close, Machiavelli reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in his understanding but in his fundamental approach to life. The systematic elimination of weakness had not made him perfect or invulnerable, but it had created a foundation of inner strength that could support whatever challenges the future might bring. The fear of social isolation had been replaced by confidence in his ability to form genuine relationships based on mutual respect and value. The need for external validation had given way to an internal sense of worth based on continuous growth and contribution. The tendency to avoid difficult decisions had been supplanted by the capacity to analyze complex situations clearly and act decisively based on careful consideration of available information. Most importantly, the work had revealed itself to be ongoing rather than completed. Each new challenge provided opportunities to strengthen areas that had been neglected or to develop entirely new capabilities. The elimination of weakness was not a destination but a way of traveling through life that created increasing competence, confidence, and influence over time. The winter that concluded Machiavelli's transformative year brought with it a profound sense of clarity about the path forward. Whether or not his political exile would end, whether or not he would return to formal positions of influence, he had developed something more valuable than any external role or recognition. The kind of inner strength that could create value and meaning regardless of external circumstances. The principles he had discovered and practiced were not dependent on any particular political system or social structure. They were universal aspects of human psychology that could be applied in any context where effectiveness and influence were desired. A merchant could use them to build a more successful business. A parent could apply them to raise stronger, more capable children. A citizen could employ them to contribute more effectively to community discussions and decisions. The transformation process itself had revealed patterns that Machiavelli believed could be systematized and taught to others. The work was challenging but not mysterious. It required commitment and persistence but not exceptional talent or circumstances. Anyone who was willing to confront their weaknesses honestly and work systematically to address them could develop the kind of strength that he had discovered in himself. This realization carried with it both opportunity and responsibility. The opportunity lay in the possibility of creating communities and institutions populated by individuals who had done this work, who possessed the kind of inner strength that could address complex challenges effectively and ethically. The responsibility involved sharing these insights with others who were ready to undertake their own transformation. As spring returned to the Tuscan countryside, bringing with it the possibility of political rehabilitation and return to active life, Machiavelli understood that his real work was just beginning. The elimination of weakness had been the foundation, but the construction of a life dedicated to meaningful contribution was the larger project that would define his remaining years. The insights gained during his year of exile would inform everything he wrote and every relationship he formed. Going forward, they would shape his understanding of effective governance, successful diplomacy, and sustainable influence. Most importantly, they would guide his efforts to help others develop the kind of strength that created both personal satisfaction and collective benefit. The document that emerged from these months of reflection and practice was not merely a theoretical treatise on the nature of weakness, but a practical guide born from direct experience of transformation. Every principle had been tested in the laboratory of daily life. Every recommendation had been verified through personal application and observation of its effects. The work of eliminating weakness, Machiavelli had learned, was simultaneously the most difficult and most rewarding challenge that any human being could undertake. It demanded the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about oneself and the persistence to change deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior. But it offered in return something that no external achievement could provide: the unshakable confidence that came from knowing that one's effectiveness was based on genuine competence rather than favorable circumstances. Whether facing prosperity or adversity, approval or criticism, success or failure, the strong individual possessed internal resources that allowed them to respond effectively rather than merely reacting emotionally. They could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential principles. They could collaborate with others while preserving their independence of thought and action. The implications of widespread adoption of these principles extended far beyond individual benefit. A society composed of emotionally sovereign, strategically patient, and independently thinking individuals would possess collective capabilities that were far superior to those available to communities dominated by weak, reactive, and conformist members. Such a society would be more resilient in the face of challenges, more innovative in solving problems, and more just in its treatment of all citizens. The vision that sustained Machiavelli through the difficult work of personal transformation was ultimately this: the possibility of contributing to the creation of such a society through his own example, his written works, and his direct influence on others who were ready to undertake their own journey toward strength. The elimination of weakness was not an end in itself, but the foundation for building something greater than any individual could achieve alone. As the seasons cycled once more and Machiavelli's understanding deepened, he recognized that the principles he had discovered were not merely personal insights, but universal truths about human nature and social dynamics. They could be applied at every level of human organization, from individual relationships to international diplomacy. The same psychological mechanisms that created weakness in individuals also operated in groups, institutions, and entire civilizations. This recognition carried profound implications for leadership and governance. Effective leaders needed to understand these dynamics not only in themselves but in their followers, their opponents, and their institutions. They needed to create systems and cultures that systematically strengthened rather than weakened the people under their influence. They needed to model the kind of strength they hoped to develop in others. The work was vast, and the timeline necessarily extended across generations rather than years, but it was also the most important work that could be undertaken because everything else, prosperity, security, justice, cultural achievement, ultimately depended on the strength of the individuals who composed society. Without that foundation, all other achievements remained vulnerable to the forces of weakness that constantly threatened to undermine human progress. Machiavelli's exile had thus become not a punishment, but a gift, an opportunity to step back from the immediate pressures of political life and discover truths that could only be perceived from a position of temporary isolation. The systematic elimination of weakness that had begun as a personal necessity had revealed itself as a civilizational imperative that would guide his work for the remainder of his life. The document that recorded these insights would serve not only as a record of his own transformation, but as a guide for others ready to undertake similar work. It would carry forward the understanding that true strength was not a gift reserved for the exceptional few, but a possibility available to anyone willing to confront their weaknesses honestly and work systematically to overcome them. In this way, the work of personal transformation became the foundation for social transformation, and the elimination of individual weakness became the beginning of collective strength. The vision was ambitious but not unrealistic. It required only that individuals choose strength over weakness, long-term thinking over immediate gratification, and genuine influence over manipulative control. The choice, as always, remained with each individual. The principles were available to all, but the work could only be done by each person for themselves. The elimination of weakness was ultimately an act of will, the decision to become stronger, wiser, and more capable regardless of the costs involved. For those willing to pay that price, the rewards were beyond calculation: freedom, effectiveness, and the satisfaction of knowing that one's life had contributed meaningfully to the advancement of human civilization.